Incoterms 2020. The Incoterms is an acronym for International Commercial Terms. It's the world's essential terms of trade for the sale of goods that published by the International Chamber of Commerce, RICC, which based in Paris. There are 11 official shipping terms that defined under the Incoterms, such as first, EXW or Ex-Works, named place of delivery. Ex-Works represents the minimum amount of responsibility to the seller. Ex-Works is the term used to describe the delivery of goods to an available destination at their place of business, normally in the factory or warehouse. The seller's only responsibility is to prepare the goods for pickup by the buyer's carrier. Second, FCA or free carrier, named place of delivery. The FCA requires the seller to deliver the goods to the buyer or its carrier, either at the seller's premises loaded onto the collecting vehicle or delivered to another premises, such as a forwarder's warehouse, airport, or container terminal, and not unloaded from the seller's vehicle. Third, FAS or free alongside ship, named port of shipment. The seller is responsible for the cost of transporting and delivering goods until to the point when they are placed alongside the vessel at the named port of shipment nominated by the buyer, but the responsibility shifts to the buyer once the goods are loaded at this point. Fourth, FOB or free on board, named port of shipment. The seller is responsible for the cost of transporting and delivering until the goods are loaded on the transport vessel. Then all responsibility shifts to the buyer. Fifth, CFR or cost and freight, named port of destination. CFR requires the seller to pay the cost and freight that necessary to bring the goods to the named destination. Sixth, CIF or cost, insurance and freight, named port of destination. The main difference between CIF and CFR is that in CIF, the seller also bears the cost of freight and insurance until goods delivered to the named port of destination. The seller required to purchase the minimum level of insurance under Clause C of the Institute Cargo Clauses. The seller required to purchase the minimum level of insurance under Clause C of the Institute Cargo Clauses. Seventh, CPT or carriage paid to, named place of destination. Seller is responsible for the cost associated with shipping until the goods are delivered to the named place of destination, which seller and buyer has arranged beforehand. 8. CIP or carriage and insurance paid to. This includes the responsibilities involved with CPT, but in CIP, the insurance is also paid by the seller up to the point of destination. The seller arranges insurance to cover the risk until the goods are delivered to the destination point.
Nine, DAP or delivered at place. The seller bears all risks and costs including export fees, carriage, incurrence, and port charge at destination, while the buyer handles all costs and risks associated with unclothing the good. 10. TPU or delivered at place unclothed. TPU is similar to DAP, except that the seller must pay for costs that associate with unclothing the good at the named place of destination. Buyer is responsible for all costs and risks from this point, including clear the good for import at the named place of destination. 11. DDP or delivered duty paid. The seller bears all risks and costs associated with delivering the good to the named place of destination ready for unloading and clear for import. This term is risky for the seller because they may not fully understand of the import clear produce in the destination country. By focusing on the seller delivery obligation within an international sales contract, Incoterm confirms three critical important considerations, and here is 1. At what physical point in a supply chain the risk of loss or damage to the goods shift from seller to buyer. This point will give us an explanation about risk management issue by Incoterms, wherein the physical supply chain thus the seller responsibility and the risk of loss or damage to the good become responsibility of the buyer. For example, goods get stolen of the terminal in foreign country, Vietnam was on a hook for that, no idea. But with Incoterm, we can identify this problem and we will know for sure. 2. At what physical point in a supply chain the responsibility for all transportation, custom clearance, duties, and related charges shift from the seller to buyer? The Incoterm will define who is in charge of the financial responsibility issue. From the financial perspective apart from the actual sales and price of the good, between the seller and buyer, there is nothing more important than this point. Incoterm will define who pay for what between the seller and the buyer, such as the cost of transportation and other related expenses. 3. Responsibility between seller and buyer for execution of certain financial activities. When we use the term seller and buyer, we're talking about exporter and importer. The seller is exporter and the buyer is importer. Our interest in Incoterm really depends on what side of the transaction we are on, who pay for the what, who is responsible for the cost that occurs because the transaction between the seller and buyer. The conclusion of treating about the Incoterm above, who on the hook for the well-being of the good at what physical place and where in the physical supply chain the task responsibility shift from seller to the buyer, who pay for what relate to domestic international transportation, custom related expenses, and who's responsible for the financial activity. Some example, who control the forex, who responsible for the incurred, if it is recurred. Incoterm will tell us that. Apart from the death treating, we need to know the meaning of the term delivery. The delivery under Incoterm does not mean what you think it means. Within the context of Incoterm, delivery does not necessarily mean up to the final destination point. That's because the term delivery under Incoterm means the point where risk of loss or damage shift from the seller to the buyer. For short, we can say that delivery under Incoterm same as risk transfer from seller to the buyer. There are few things that Incoterm do and do not do that we need to know, such as 1. In a contract for sale between a seller and buyer, Incoterm cover A. Transfer of risk of loss or damage to the good. B. Responsibility for transportation, custom, and related expenses. C. Certain functional responsibilities related to the delivery of the good. 2. In a contract for sale between a seller and buyer, Incoterm do not cover A. Title transfer, B. Renew, reconnection, C. Remedies for breach of contract, D. Payment term, E. Verified gross match or VGM, F. Any other non-delivery related costs in a comprehensive sales contract.
Incoterm 2020 Key changes and updates. Here are the key changes and updates between Incoterm 2010 and Incoterm 2020. 1. DAT changed to DPU. The drafting group made the choice of removing the word terminal, as it often caused confusion. DAT required delivery at terminal unloaded. However, following on from feedback to the drafting committee, it was decided to change the term to DPU, or delivery at place unloaded, to broadly cover any place. 2. Insurance cover differs between chief and chip. Under chief or chip, the seller buys insurance for the buyer. In Incoterm 2010, insurance is required under Clause C, but in 2020, chip requires insurance complying with Institute Cargo Clause, whereas chief requires insurances under Clause C. Three. The listing of costs. All costs are now listed in the allocation of costs section for each rule to avoid confusions. Back then in Incoterm 2010, costs were a big issue. Carriers often changed their pricing structure to deal with at once, and sellers were often surprised by being back charged terminal handling charge. The A9 section in the Incoterm rules could now collect together the costs, with the principle of clearly stating the cost to each party. 4. Security requirements. Cargo security has been particularly important, and then 2020 rules now address many of the security-related requirements. From a carriage requirement perspective, security-related allocation and the necessary cost association have been added. 5. Own transport. Incoterm 2010 rules assume that goods carried from the seller to the buyer were via third party. Incoterm 2020 allow for own means of transport by the buyer in the VCI rules and by the seller in the D rules. 6. VCA and bills of lading. In the 2010 Incoterm rules, exporters were encouraged to use VCA, with same base for the both parties, seller and buyer. However, many people were using VOB when they should really been using VCA, because a standard letter of credit requires an on-board bill of lading to be present. Therefore, the sellers were often taking the risk and using VOB instead, because they want to get paid under the LC, the Encounter 2020 VCA Extra Provision now states that if the parties have so agreed, the buyer must instruct the carrier to issue to the seller at the buyer's cost and risk a transport document stating that the goods have been loaded. Seven, presentation and design. Encounter 2020 rules have much more extensive explanatory notes with better diagram, a different structure for user and a recording of rules to make delivery and risk more obvious. Maritime related rules still have not changed and remain at the back of the rulebook. Thank you.